The word zakat means, it comes from a root word which means to purify. And the idea is that it is a purification of your wealth. Everybody in accruing wealth will have some either clearly doubtful or even really doubtful aspects to the accruement of wealth. So the idea is that zakat is a way of purifying your wealth. And the Prophet Muhammad prohibited the taking of zakat for his own family. They cannot be recipients of zakat. Bani Hashim. The reason is that he said that zakat is like the feces of wealth. In other words, the body needs to let go of its impurities in order to maintain its purity. And zakat is seen as a letting go of one's wealth in order to purify and make the wealth that it has grow, literally.
Yeah, but if how do they then turn that around to the recipient who is receiving this?
The recipient who receives the wealth, for the person it is a purification.
Yes.
For the one receiving the wealth, it is a right. It's seen as a right. And so it changes perspective. There's a shift in perspective. In other words, the one receiving it is not receiving anything filthy. Right? It's a right. And it's encouraged when you give zakat to somebody to not tell them it's zakat, so that they don't feel, to give it as a gift, so that they don't feel, because some people have a pride, they don't want to feel like they're like a welfare type state, that I need, that it's encouraged. You don't have to tell them it's zakat. It's also encouraged to give it smiling with as seeing that it's an honor. So the person giving it, these are in the books of fiqh related to giving zakat, that you're supposed to give it in humility, not in arrogance. That you give it to the person literally feeling like you're honored to do that thing. And the Prophet said one of the signs of the end of time is people will consider zakat like a fine. In other words, they wouldn't see it as an honor, but rather as like taxes nowadays, right? Have to pay it.
Clearly both parties involved, both sides know kind of what's going on. Don't they have an understanding of, like say
I've given zakat many times in which the people had no idea that it was zakat.
Oh really?
Absolutely. Many times.
Is there any example that you can give of how would that?
Well, Muslims, I think you'd be really surprised at the generosity of Muslims that are practicing to other Muslims. They're very generous. If within a community, like in my community, for instance, we had a man who recently lost his job, and I found out about it, and I knew that he was in a hard condition. I contacted a few people, and in one day we raised $4,000, and I gave that to that person, right, just to help him for the next couple months until he could get a job again. And I didn't tell him. I said, this a gift, Now there were people that gave it as zakat, but I didn't, I don't have to tell them it's zakat. Mm-hmm.
There are times when you'll find things on your doorstep.
That's true.
You may find a rack of lamb, you may find an envelope of money, and you don't know who.
Very common in the Muslim community. There's definitely, I think Muslims do still have a sense of taking care. Like things like homelessness in the Muslim world, those are still real shocking. Like the other day we saw a man, and I was with Sheikh Abdullah, and he didn't have a shirt on. And he asked me first if he was crazy. Because in their country, you would never not wear a shirt in public. It would literally be, for them, it's a sign somebody was mad. And the same with shorts. That's something he hasn't, I don't think he's quite grasped it yet. Just because their culture is still very, very modest. But we told him that he's probably homeless, and he said, "What does that mean?" And he literally didn't know what it meant, because in that country you could they just build like they take tree limbs, and the women will sew like burlap sacks together and make a little house, and you don't have to pay property tax, and you don't have to, you just set up shop. And he didn't have a concept of like being homeless, and And then he just said to me, with all of this, like, there's so much here. You know, because he's coming from a place where there's nothing. And he said, how is it that, like, somebody could be without a place to sleep? With all, like, it was something that I don't think his intellect really could quite grasp, right? Very kind of interesting. Really interesting book to read about this is Winners and Losers in the New World Order by Jacques Attali, right? He talks about this phenomenon of increasingly, people becoming accustomed to planetary boat people. That's what he calls them. Planetary boat people. Where you'll go to the ATM and the bums there, and we just become inured to it because it just becomes more and more difficult for people to deal with.
How is the giving of zakat in relationship to whether the receiver is Muslim or not?
The receiver, that's a good question. Let me tell you and I'm going to get to that. Let me tell you basically, zakat is a local tax. It is not meant to go outside of the community. The Prophet said those closest to you are most worthy of your help. So the idea of acting locally is really important. That, if you're fighting for the rights of the Tibetans, and your own community, there's people oppressed, the Muslims would see that as a kind of disconnection. It doesn't mean that you're not sympathetic with something happening over there, but the thing is you begin at home. You begin cleaning up your own home. So zakat goes back to the wealth of the local community. If there was no one in that community that is impoverished or needs zakat, then it will go outside of the community. And you first give to your relatives who are in need before you would give to strangers. Now, the recipients of zakat, there are 8 categories mentioned in the Quran itself, and those are considered the only recipients of zakat. One of the only non-Muslim group are what are called mu'allafat qulubuhum, which are people who are very close to Islam. They're very interested in Islam, they're close to Islam. Those people, it's permissible to give them zakat money. If they're not Muslim, then you can donate money to them, but you cannot give zakat. Zakat is the right of poor Muslims. In other words, the idea that you take care of your own before you go outside. But traditionally, the Muslims in the early 19th century, during a famine in France, the Bey of Tunis and Algeria sent wheat to Europe to help relieve the famine. So traditionally the Muslims did have a concept of helping other peoples if they had a surplus. But first you help the people within your community. And then also Jewish, there's a beautiful story of Sayyidina Omar, because Jewish and Christian and non-Muslim peoples like Buddhists and others pay a tax to live under the Muslims. And Omar saw a Jewish man begging, an old man, and he said, "Why is this man begging?" And they said, "He doesn't have any money." And he said, "We took money from him when he was young, so we should take care of him in his old age." And so he demanded that Christian and Jews and other people, if they had no one within their community to take care of them, then there should be money taken out of what's called the Bayt al-Mal, or the collective bank of the Muslim government, to help those people. And it's interesting that during the time of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz in Damascus, the government actually paid for and supplied people, not dogs, but people to take care of blind people as an employment, right, which is mentioned in the books.
Is there a certain percentage then that they make?
Good question. The percentage is, there are 3 types of zakat. Income tax is prohibited in Islam. You cannot tax people for income that they're using to live by. You can only tax them according to standing wealth that 1 year has accumulated. So if a year has passed and you still have the wealth, that's what you pay zakat on. You don't pay zakat based on what you made that year. So if I made $50,000, but at the end of the year I have 0, which is the case of a lot of people in this country, right? And they actually have to borrow to pay the IRS, that you do not pay any zakat. You pay zakat at the end of a lunar year. You pay zakat on what you have that a year has transpired with. And you pay 1/40th 2.5%.
Of the leftover?
No, of the entire thing. So if I had $40, I would pay $1.
Oh, yeah, so you pay 1/40 of what remains after.
After the whole year, yes.
If you-
Yeah, it's not a big amount. But if, go ahead.
You may only need, let's say, a $6,000 car to get around, of wants and needs.
Right.
I mean, you may only need, let's say, a $6,000 car to get around,
But you buy a $100,000 one.
Exactly.
Okay. Herb asked, I think, a good question. Where does want and need come into this? In other words, if I'm a wealthy person and I buy a car for $100,000, and I'm a poor person, I buy one for $500. Can I just spend my money on that? Yes. Wealthy people, their money is discretionary. It is highly discouraged to waste, and it is actually prohibited to be grossly extravagant. But the Prophet Muhammad said, Allah loves to see the traces of His blessings on His creatures. And so it's encouraged for a wealthy person to dress not extravagantly. He should wear things in order to show the blessing on him. And there's a beautiful book called Envy Towards a Social Theory. Fascinating book about the disruptive aspects of envy in a culture. And one of the worst things in Islam is envy. It's literally considered one of the worst things. It's one of the 7 deadly sins in the Christian Catholic tradition. My father was Catholic, and he said that he's unfortunately familiar with about 4 of them. And his friend told him, one's enough to kill you. But envy is one of the 7 deadly sins, right? In our Western tradition. In the Islamic tradition, it's also one of the real bad things. And so the idea is that poor people should not envy rich people. It's really considered a bad thing to envy rich people. Poor people should thank God. In fact, the Prophet Muhammad said, in terms of your worldly condition, always look to people below you. And in terms of your otherworldly condition, always look at people better than you. So in terms of righteousness, piety, look at people that are superior to you, that you might never become deluded about yourself and you always want to improve. But in terms of the material world, look at people worse off than you so that you feel grateful for what you have.
Just briefly, what was the book that you said was, you mentioned the effect of envy?
Yeah, it's called Envy Towards a Social Theory, and it's a German author, and I can't remember his name right now. I actually just got the book a couple months ago, and so I don't have the author's name yet.
If there's no income tax and Zakat is determined on somebody's net,
it's like a capital gains tax more. It's like capital at the end of the year.
Okay, does the Zakat satisfy and fulfill the needs of the poor? Is it their poor due?
There is a scholar in Qatar who has proven that if Zakat was paid in the Muslim world, there would be a gross surplus of wealth today. It's very interesting because there's also Zakat of agriculture and livestock. So agriculture has 1/5. Now the World Bank estimated that if 2% of the world's agricultural crops were taxed, 2%, that there would be no hunger anywhere. Now Islam says 5% for irrigation that you did yourself, 10% for agriculture based on natural irrigation like rain and things like that. So if you didn't work, you pay more. If you did irrigation, you pay less. So 10% of wheat, corn, barley, all of these grains is taxed, and it's supposed to be given and distributed to the poor. Also livestock. So for every 5 camels, 1 sheep is given, like that, right? 30 cows, a calf, 40.
Question, you were talking about the livestock, and I was just thinking about Saudi Arabia, and all the pilgrimage, when all these people come and they wish to make sacrifices.
Right.
How do they deal with it?
They can them and they send them around to poor people around the world. That's what they do now. The meat that's sacrificed during the Hajj, and no, I didn't sacrifice. You don't have to sacrifice if you made there's 3 ways of making Hajj. And I made it the way that the Prophet ﷺ made it, where it's not obligatory to sacrifice. You can if you want to. I did not sacrifice. But if you do sacrifice, the meat can either be eaten there. It's encouraged to distribute it amongst the poor. And the Eid, the reason that's encouraged to sacrifice during the Eid traditionally was that poor people generally did not eat meat very often. And so the idea was on the Eid, it was a time when you brought meat to the poor people to give them meat. Now meat is becoming more increasingly cheaper, and so you're finding people are meat eaters all over. Sayyidina Omar said, beware of meat because it has the addiction of wine. And he also said to one man who used to eat meat every day, every time you desire meat, you buy it? And he said, yes. And he said, I'm afraid you're going to be from the people who lose all their good deeds in this world. In other words, that you enjoy the world so much that you can't show the right gratitude. So it was not encouraged to eat meat all the time. And now Muslims have become heavy meat eaters, but traditionally most Muslim cultures were really more semi-vegetarian cultures. It's kind of more of a recent phenomenon, the heavy meat. And beef is very new in the Muslim world. Traditionally Muslims were not beef eaters. They were goat and sheep.
In Muslim cultures, where, particularly in the 20th century, where there's been, you say, oil discovery and wealth, how is that affected Zakah? Is it causing problems between?
That's a really good point. Yeah, there is a lot of problems. There's a lot of resentment. There's a lot of envy, things like that. But technically, buried wealth, there's different opinions about it. Most of the scholars say that it goes to the Muslim collective bank, what's called the Bayt al-Mal, and it should be used to develop the Muslim communities, to help the poor, to build schools, to do these things. It should not be personal wealth. Some say that no, 20%. It should be taxed 20%, and then the land of the people that it was found on, they're the ones that benefit from it. So there are some differences of opinion, but there's definitely, in many of the countries where there's been natural resources discovered, and the Muslims do have a lot of natural resources in the Muslim communities, there's just been a gross expropriation of the wealth and exploitation of it, which is very unfortunate. And there's also been a lot of outside influences. I mean, we know when Mossadegh, who was the prime minister of Iran, wanted to nationalize the oil, there was a CIA coup that ousted him. So there's hands outside that are also impacting very seriously how the wealth is being used. People, if you know about petrodollars, then you know the fact that the vast majority of petro wealth is literally being supplanted and invested in Western banks, and the Western banks in turn are using that to finance a lot of the projects in the quote-unquote third world, which end up causing major problems because of interest payment and things like that. So very complicated world conditions, but I think they're really worthwhile bringing up to your students, because we have to, as communities, we just have to start thinking about this stuff. We're so marginalized from these dialogues, and I think just normal people should be participating in trying to understand what's going on. Why are countries like Mexico, paying these massive interests to, there's more interest now coming out of the third world than there is aid going into it. So there's a lot of very serious contradictions going on, and then a lot of the massive projects that are being developed, the World Bank and the IMF encouraging these gross projects, the dam now in China and Brazil and these type of things that really, if you read somebody like Suzanne George, really worth reading. Fate Worse Than Debt, Ill Fares the Land, How the Other Side Dies. She worked for the World Bank and then kind of reneged and realized that she felt that they were doing a lot more harm than good. And she's written some really, really worthwhile critiques. And not from a kind of conspiratorial type, just really kind of analyzing the thing. I think Suzanne George, she works now, I think she's supported by the Catholic Church, actually, one of their organizations.
You said there are 8 types of Zakah. There are 8 recipients.
Recipients.
There are 3 types of Zakah. Can you run through?
Poor people. by definition, there are two types of poor people. One is called miskeen, and the other is called faqir in the Quran. The miskeen is the one who doesn't even have a day's worth of their livelihood. The poor one is somebody who does not have a year's supply. They do not have enough money to get through a year, and they are accepted as a recipient for.
Deserving poor and undeserving, where the Christian charities see it.
Yeah, that's a good point. If the person is known to use things, like if they're alcoholic or known to do things, then yeah, you should not support people that you know the money is going to go, and there are more worthy people for it. That is encouraged to look for the more worthy people. And then you have the people who collect it. So there is a portion of it taken out to employ the zakat collectors. And then you have indebted people, people who are in debt. And that is a type of debt as long as it was not accrued through wrong actions like gambling. And it is a debt in which they're in serious trouble. The debt has reached a level where socially they're really being jeopardized. And then you have and also indentured servants, people who bonds people. Because in Islam, traditionally, although this doesn't exist anymore in the Muslim world, traditionally there were people who were bondspeople that were under the yoke of somebody. And those people in Sharia, if they desire to be freed from that yoke, then they have a right to zakat to pay off whatever their worth is, right? And so that's a group. And then also so that's 5. And then you have the and then you have people, the Ibn Sabil, who is somebody who's traveling, and this is also pre-ATM because he can be a wealthy person as well. So it's somebody who's traveling and they were robbed and they're far away from their home and they don't have access. And it still happens because ATM isn't, right? 80% of the world still doesn't have telephones. By the way, right? So here we forget about that, right? But it's for somebody who was traveling and they lost their wealth. Those people are asked, they're permitted to get to receive the zakat. And then for people who are called mu'allafat qulubuhum, which are either near Islam or they have just come into Islam, and you can give them zakat as a way of binding their hearts to the community. And then the last group is fi sabilillah, which are people who are defending the homelands. So anybody who is defending, like jihad, like the Bosnians, when they were fighting, many people sent their zakat to Bosnia or Afghanistan, for instance, right? And there are many people, I think, that support the Palestinians, viewing that as a valid, struggle, things like that. So. That's basically those are the recipients, according to the Quran.
I would think that the answer to this would be no, but if you're an American Muslim and you're paying 35% income tax, you also pay 2.5% wealth tax?
Absolutely. In fact, more so. Some of the scholars have said if you're giving 35% to the American government, which is using a lot of it for things that you should probably give another 35% just to counterbalance, and then pay zakat on top of that. A lot of Muslims have a lot of cognitive dissonance about taxes in this country, particularly immigrants who, their countries are, there's just a lot of problems going on, and they feel there's a lot of cognitive dissonance there, because of such a huge portion of our taxes go to military. I think 54% is still allotted to defense and military budgets and things like that. I mean, what's education? 17%? Is it even? No, I think it's what? 17%? It's about 17%, right? So, but again, if you're in a country, you have to follow the laws of the land. So it's actually prohibited if you come into a country by Sharia, even though the laws are against Islam, you either have to make hijrah or you have to follow those laws. It is prohibited, like it would be prohibited for a Muslim to cheat on the income tax, given that that is a law in this country. They would either have to leave or they would have to pay it, because the conditions of coming into the country, one of the conditions is that you'll obey the laws of the land. And the Prophet said, the Quran says that fulfill the trust that you have given to its people. So when a person comes into this country with a visa or a green card, and it says you're expected to obey the laws of the land, then you are expected to. So it's actually a breach of Islam not to. And that is something, unfortunately, some Muslims aren't aware of.
Just sort of clarifying point. I heard two different things. One, that it cannot be for your own family, and the other, that it's first to be for your own family.
No, it can't be for your own family if it's like a trick. In other words, I give my wife my zakat, she gives me her zakat. No, it's to your family if they're poor and worthy. Then they should be the first recipients. Now the government does have the right, if there was a valid Islamic government, they do have the right to collect zakat. That is a right of the government, and the government would distribute it. In the absence of government gathering of zakat, then it is an individual responsibility on the Muslims.
How do you determine what is a valid government?
Well, any government that has that has the authority is considered valid. If there's it's prohibited to go out against the government. Like revolution is actually prohibited in Islam, in the Sunni tradition, not in the Shia tradition. They do have a difference. I mean, that is an important distinction. The Sunni tradition believes that they have a right to fight and oppose an unjust government, whereas the Sunni tradition says that the people should be patient and ask God to change the conditions and rectify themselves, but they should not actually physically bear arms, because that would lead to a greater tribulation than the actual injustice, which is bloodshed amongst people. So in the Sunni tradition, it's actually like what's happening in Algeria, for instance. That's prohibited by Islamic law to do that. And that is the classical Islamic view. And the group that goes out are called Khawarij, which are the seceders. And you can find them historically. There's always been groups that have said that. But the traditional Sunni position is that you cannot go against the ruler. Any other questions?
When you mention a legitimate Islamic government, would this be a government that has as its ultimate law?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the ideal. But even if they're not implementing the Quran and they don't openly say that they don't believe in it, they're still considered the legitimate government.
So they would then have the right to collect these?
Yes.
And this could be in lieu of a welfare department or something like this?
Zakat, that's the whole point of zakat. Yeah, it's to help the poor people. It's a right of the poor people. And it's interesting because the Prophet said, take from your wealthy the zakat and return it to the poor people. So it's almost like, people get rich off poor people, because the vast majority of the world's population is poor. I mean, we forget that. We really do have a very high living standard. But the vast majority of the world's population are poor people. And the wealth, even America's wealth, is largely dependent on a lot of, of wealth from other countries. We have very cheap oil in this country. I mean, for example, for a liter of Coke is about how much? I don't buy Coke, but what are you paying there? $1. $1? You're paying more for sugar and water than you are for a liter of oil. Right? And sugar and water are pretty much inexhaustible resources. Relatively, I know there's some problems now with water and things like that. Whereas oil, you're dealing with an inexhaustible resource. It's grossly underpriced. Oil is grossly underpriced. I mean, we're paying $1.40 for a gallon of gas. It'll take you 30 miles, 40 miles, and you pay relatively the same amount for a bottle of sugar water that's going to rot your teeth and give you diabetes, So it's really interesting that oil is so cheap. And I mean, oil should probably be around What's that?
I was saying 4 or 5.
At least. I mean, my father now, that's what he's in. You know, he left teaching and got in because my grandfather was in the oil business, and he got in it through, when he married my mother, he started working in that, and he's always going on about it. Drives him crazy because, you know, he said it should be around at least 50 a barrel or something like that. It's just grossly underpriced. So, but we have the luxury of having very cheap oil. And the majors, it's hard to believe, but they actually maintain those low prices, you know. So, and the exploration in this country it's unbelievable how difficult it is to explore oil in this country. There are still lots of, you know, oil reserves in this country, and most of the old oil fields of the 1930s and 40s were very shallow. You know, they didn't have the technology to go down, you know, several miles. They just would go down very short amounts. But oil it's really discouraged to explore oil in this country, and most of the majors are just not interested anymore, you know, because they're making so much money off. It's more expensive. It's much cheaper to buy underpriced oil from the Arabian Peninsula than it is to explore and exploit the resources here. Mm-hmm.
Well, I know you want to cover the last couple points here, but let me just clarify one thing. Is it so Muslims in the United States would pay obviously the federal and state and city income property taxes?
Yeah.
Although they owe, in addition to that, they pay 2.5%.
Yes.
Of,
and many of them do, and many of them don't. There are many Muslims that don't pay zakat anymore, but there are many that still do, because now it's just it's an individual thing. There are many Muslims in my area. There are about 70,000 Muslims estimated in the Greater Bay Area. Maybe from that 70,000, 8,000 to 10,000 are actually praying. So, and from that 8,000 to 10,000 of those praying, there might not be some that are paying zakat. So it's now become more of an individual. I mean, do you think that's a fair estimate, Suleiman? Because you're more familiar with those type numbers than I am. Isn't it? I reason it's about 10% generally within any given population in this country. Do you think that's accurate?
Yeah, that's correct.
So, and Muslims often fall in very high tax brackets in this country because there's a lot of physicians, there's a lot of engineers, so they're paying a lot of taxes, right? Mm-hmm.
In this category, in the zakat category, is that where you were planning to discuss the idea of lending at interest and paying interest in this sort of?
That's another. I was going to do that with the Sharia, but I can bring that up now. The idea of just, yeah. Let me just get through that. Go ahead.
Okay. No, lost it. I'll come back.
Okay. Just when it comes back.